In this episode of Public Sector Voices, we're joined by Lahari Ramuni, a researcher from Centre for Cities, who has been looking into the effects that COVID restrictions have had on our high streets. Lahari holds an undergraduate degree in economics and a master's in public policy.
I am Lahari Ramuni. I'm a researcher at the think tank Centre for Cities. We're an urban policy think tank who's focused on using data to understand and improve the economies of the cities and large towns in the UK.
So the way that I came across your work is through Centre for Cities, obviously, and the work that you did, you've still carrying on to do around the Eat Out to Help Out scheme. So how successful do you actually think that was as a scheme?
So the work that we did on Eat Out to Help Out is a part of a broader package of work that we're doing around high streets and city centres. So when we first went into lockdown, we started looking at how footfall has been affected in city centres, and we've done that in the context of, what's happened with the scheme. And what we see is that, if we compare footfall and spending both to the Monday to Wednesday sales in July, compare that to August, footfall is up about 23% across the country, and then spending is up about 49%.
In terms of, I was thinking when I was reading through the research that obviously you're saying that it's up within those, and it's up. I believe it's up even at the weekends as well. Like it kind of carries over. Do you think that there's an element of just, well, we're getting longer into the pandemic and people are just a bit more relaxed about things?
I think within that context, what it tells us is that the scheme didn't just move people from, going out on a Friday to going out on a Monday to Wednesday. In terms of whether people are getting more used to going out or relaxed to going out, it's harder to say because we're not, it's not based on, survey data or YouGov polls where it's sort of based on talking to people. But what we do see in terms of people's behavior is that the footfall goes up continually throughout August. So it's not like first week people go out and then, no one's going out and people are a bit more reluctant. But what we actually see is that, first week there's people going out, second, third, and there's a reasonably larger proportion of people going out towards the end of August. And I think this might have something to do with the paychecks paying in, but it does indicate that, people haven't come out to eat out and then found things a bit too daunting or anxious and gone back in. So
in the research, I can't remember if it was this one or one that you'd done a couple of weeks ago that I covered as well. I noticed that the footfall was up considerably in like seaside towns and things like that.
Yes.
But really there wasn't a huge amount of difference in the bigger cities like London, like Manchester, like Birmingham.
Yeah.
So what can be done in those sort of places to replicate the results that we've seen in the seaside towns?
So that's a really interesting question, and it sort of fits with the broad pattern that we've seen since before Eat Out to Help Out, or just going into lockdown as well. So in large cities like Manchester, Birmingham, London, Newcastle, footfall fell to a much lower level compared to pre-lockdown levels than it did in smaller places, and it also recovered faster in smaller places than it did in large places. So I think some of it's to do with the fact that in larger city centres you tend to have more office space, a greater reliance on public transport, so people don't have the same sort of need, and also the same sort of ability to go back into city centres, whereas the seaside towns tend to be a little bit smaller. So we're looking at places like, Portsmouth, Blackpool, Southend, which have done really well. And I think part of it is also to do with the fact that we're looking at August compared to February. So the weather would have helped drawing people to seaside towns as well. I think the difficulty with the large city centres is they did really, really well before we went into lockdown, precisely because they had lots of office space, and it meant that people would sort of come in and out regardless of instead of coming to city centers as a destination. So you might pick up a sandwich at lunch in a cafe, or you might go to the pub after work, or you might pop into the shops at some point during the day. And this really helped the large city centres, and the lack of workers is really hurting them because of how their city centres are structured.
They're not just being told by central government, you're doing this, and the results are kind of whatever happens, happens.
Yeah, I mean, I think since beginning of lockdown, local authorities have taken quite a proactive role. So in the beginning, it was more to do with making sure that people were aware of the kind of support that was available to them. And then when city centres and town centres started reopening, it was making sure that they had the social distancing rules, signage, and that kind of thing in place. And I think what we're seeing now is a continuation of that. So, for instance, Andy Burnham's been talking about how the 10 p.m. closure rule doesn't really make sense for at least in the context of Manchester, and how that calls for a review. But also, we've also seen leaders from Newcastle asking for increased restrictions on movement on behalf of national government because cases were going up. So I don't think local authorities have particularly been passive participants. They've been quite proactive through the process, and that's something that's still continuing.
Touching on that, I suppose, because the high streets are quite a big part of, there's a lot of money that goes into high streets, a lot of money generated by high streets and by people coming into city centres and towns. What do you think would happen if the high street were to go away completely? Is coronavirus the nail in the coffin for high streets, or is it just a hurdle?
Oh, in terms of analogies, I wish I could think of a good one, but in terms of the high streets, yes, high streets have been struggling even before coronavirus hit, especially because of internet shopping and how people have been changing their shopping behavior. Now, what's what we need to remember is that not all high streets were struggling. There's a lot of places where the high street was doing pretty well, and a lot of them were places with lots of office spaces where they had this sort of captive footfall. But coronavirus poses a challenge for high streets that's sort of twofold. So it's what it's done is exacerbated and accelerated the existing challenge of online shopping. So before we went into lockdown, I think about 20% of all retail sales in the UK were done online, whereas now we've gotten to that being about 30% because people have moved to doing more of their supermarket shopping online, clothes shopping online, and things like that. But it's given the new challenge of taking the office workers that made those strong city centres strong in the first instance, and I think that's in that sense it's sort of challenging in two different ways, but also challenging for places that haven't found it so challenging in the past.
So I was going to bring up a bit of a case study for Altrincham. I don't know if you're aware of it. I'm imagining that you will be at least familiar with
Yes.
their regeneration project that they've done over the past sort of 10 years or so. With me saying that high streets have been on the decline and that there's been a bit of a sense of, oh well, they're going anyway, everything's going online. Do you think that really there needs to be a push? Like Altrincham was always had that footfall, and then now it's an incredibly busy place, and there's a real sense of, if we can put money into it and regenerate an area, that the high street isn't dying at all.
I think it's about also trying to get an understanding for what are the things that are happening in the successful places, or places that had good high streets that were doing well. And what we see is that a lot of them have a different kind of mix. So whereas in weak high streets, we see them have a lot more retail and a lot less food and leisure and a lot less offices. On the other hand, in stronger places, they have a lot less retail and a lot more food and leisure, and also a lot more services. So things like nail salons, hairdressers, barbers have been on the up in the last few years, and basically things that you can't necessarily do from home, and things that bring you into the city center. So it's understanding that what the consumers of high streets want a bit more these days is an experience as opposed to just buying stuff.
Because I think that's something that Altrincham has done really well in the
Mm-hmm.
sense of there's a lot of bars there. The market that they redid
Mm-hmm.
isn't just market stalls. You can go and get food there. You can do pretty much everything in that market and in the
Mm-hmm.
town centre.
Mm-hmm.
More generally, do you think that, I suppose, with places that the councils are like letting out to businesses, do you think they need to be a bit more picky rather than thinking, right, well, if we can get some rent in, then let's get somebody in, and be a bit more picky and think, actually, we'll vet the businesses coming in a little bit more and see if they're more likely to last?
Um, that's a that's an interesting question. I guess I do think there's a role for local authorities in terms of curating the offer of the high street. So, what kind of mix does it have in terms of leisure? What kind of mix does it have in terms of housing, in terms of broad categories? But I think we can almost get into the territory of deciding from our own personal experience and perspective what is a good thing to have and what isn't necessarily a good thing to have. I think if things start up and they run and they work and people have the demand for it, then it's a good thing. But I think it's a little bit difficult to know before you've done that what the local market wants.
Yeah, because I would kind of agree with that. Like you say, that it's not a case of necessarily just looking at an area. You could look at an area 300-400 miles away, and that's a completely
Mm-hmm.
different space to the area that you're in.
Yeah.
Um, what research can be done? What can they do to make sure that they're getting the best for the people that live in that area?
I guess one way to approach it is start with having flexible spaces and flexible contracts. And if you see that you've started off with something and it works and it is viable, it's in the interest of both the business and the local authority to continue that on, and it just gives both the place and the business the flexibility to sort of experimentally and go back and forth and figure out what suits the place and what more than anything, what is their demand for.
From your answers, I don't think the high street is, a dead entity basically. But I was going to say, what if the high street were to go? What could local authorities do to reclaim that sort of money? Do you think there is any way that? What would they do with that space? I suppose.
I think this is more a question about the space rather than the money, because in terms of the revenues, what sort of gets back to local authorities is the business rates that the businesses pay on them, and it's still quite national, and it's only a fraction of the business rates that are paid that accrue to the local authority. So the important part for local authorities, at least in the present context, is trying to understand what you can do with that space. I think the most important thing that we learn from our research is that it's having people sort of captive footfall. So people not needing to come in to the high street or the town centre as a destination, but something that somewhere that they're there already anyway. So having offices or having dense residential areas around the city centre, around the high street, is something that helps the existing businesses. But if you've got high street decline, and if you've got vacant shop fronts, then it's worth considering converting them into other users, especially in terms of flexible workspaces that might be useful and that might be demanded in the post-COVID world. But I would also caution against doing large scale investments or large scale changes before we know how working from home settles and how common a thing it is and how it changes across different places.
Well, I was glad you said that
Hmm.
with do regenerations and invest lots of money into high streets, because
Hmm.
where I'm from, a town called Sale that's just next to Altrincham,
Right.
and we keep getting told, why don't we do something like Altrincham and invest a lot of money, and we get a lot of pushback from people saying, well, this isn't right, we don't need more office space, we don't need this, we don't need that.
Hmm.
Um, but is there a real demand for office space in a town centre? Do we need office space to make the high street work, or is it kind of a case of, well, if the high street's
Hmm.
good enough, then people will come in regardless of the office space?
No, I mean what we've definitely seen in our previous research is that places with the office spaces, with the office workers coming in, and especially high skilled office workers coming in who are generally a bit more high paid, the vacancy rates are lower in those places. The quality of retail is better in those places. Now, I do have to caveat that with that is research that was done in pre-COVID world. Um,
Mhm.
and what and I think the work from home experience has taught a lot of us that there's definitely parts of our jobs that we can do from home, and there's definitely parts of our jobs that are better done from the office. So in terms of in terms of activities that we undertake on a day-to-day basis that only need me working on my own, for example, like doing emails, I can do that relatively well, either whether regardless of whether I'm doing them from home or whether I'm doing them from the office. But when it comes to collaborating with colleagues, doing brainstorming as to what work we're going to do or how we're going to do it, and also building and maintaining those relationships with them, that is something that's better done in the office, and that's something that better done also with other firms in locations that are convenient to everybody to get to, like city centres. So I don't think the role of city centres is going away, but how much we use it and what we use it for is undergoing a bit of change. And it is too early to tell if we're going to end up in a world where everybody works from home 4 days a week or everybody works from home 2 days a week. And without knowing that, we're not going to get a good idea for how much local services are supported by the office worker for, and what demand is there for locals for these services like retail and cafes and pubs by workers.
Well, I think that sort of wraps it up, really.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah.
is there anything that you'd like to add on to the end? Any final thoughts? Anything that you've wanted to say that maybe you haven't had the chance to in any of your answers?
Yes. So we've been looking into how high streets and city centres are performing across the UK using our high streets recovery tracker. And that's available on our website for anybody that works in local authorities and wants to get a better understanding of how their local area is performing.
Great. Well, thank you very much for being on. Thank you very
Hmm.
much for getting back in touch with me when I emailed you.
No, of course.
Um, and I hope you've enjoyed yourself. I've enjoyed speaking to you.
Yeah, it's
So
been
thank you
interesting.
very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Um,
We'll have to maybe do it again sometime after the COVID is all, and see where we're at with that, and see what the predictions have said and what the research says.
yes, absolutely. I mean, I am in the process of trying to figure out what our sort of next 6 month plan is going to be for our research into high streets and city centres. So um, it would be interesting to talk about where we end up, especially in terms of the previously strong city centres, whether they recover or whether we see, a much harder place for the high street in general as well.
I think it'll be definitely interesting to see. I think it's one of the main things that people pay attention to is where the high street's at, and I think that's generally a good gauge of where the economy's at. If
Hmm.
you can see people back in the high street, then we're probably going in the right direction.
Yeah, and again, regardless of how much it reflects the current economic state, which to a great extent it does. I think it does impact sentiment. And at least for that reason, it's quite important to understand it and sort of stay on top of it.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, make sure to subscribe so you never miss another.